Welcome to Drinks with Defenders. I'm Addie B-Plate.
And I'm Kayla Murphy. We're two law school friends turned criminal defense attorneys turned podcast hosts.
We're here in this space because we now work in separate offices and miss collaborating with each other.
We've been talking about creating a podcast for years where we talk about the complexities of the criminal justice system, the aspects of it that we grapple with, and the importance of what we do.
At the end of a long work week, we want to sit down, have a drink with each other, and talk about the rabbit holes of criminal defense, just like we always have. So let's get into it. Cheers!
You are a healthy little duck to be eating yogurt. I love that for you.
And that quesadilla. The quesadilla wasn't as healthy, but it wasn't bad.
No,
so.
It's protein. Right? Cheese? Protein? Question mark? Calcium? I don't know, man.
Something.
It sounds. I mean, I had freaking cheese fries. So, I mean,
as you should.
Oh, fuck, man. So what's up? How's your week been? You've had a stressful week, haven't you? I know it's only just started.
It's day one. I will say that it is always really rough going back into a short week after a long weekend as a public defender, because the start of the week, it's always like people getting arrested and stuff over the weekend. And so it's just kind of like figuring out what happened over the weekend, seeing if things that were supposed to get filed at the end of the week actually hit files. And then the first day of any week, there's jury trial status call. And so then pushing that into the short week, fewer days with fewer trials. So it was just bananas. And then jury trial status call this morning, it's usually at 8:30. It got moved to 9:00. Which just kind of, I think, to some extent, screwed everybody's calendar up in terms of running from courtroom to courtroom. And so a bunch of people from my office, we were like juggling 2 different courtrooms at once, which is common, but it was a little bit more difficult than it normally is. Luckily, I didn't have to juggle 2 courtrooms, but I was trying to help other attorneys in my office who were having to. So it wasn't, this week isn't as rough as, it's so annoying. And this week isn't as rough as my last 2 weeks, because last week I had 2 motions to suppress. We went halfway through one, we continued the other, and those are just huge hearings. And then the week before that, I had a trial. And yeah, Kayla, I think we talked about it maybe the last time on the pod, like losing a trial is really hard. Emotionally. And it was the first time I've kind of gone through that. So I feel like all of last week was kind of the come down from that. And I had a trial right after I got back from vacation. So the past 2 weeks were just kind of a whirlwind. And so today was, yes, it was crazy, but it was the first day professionally in the last 3 weeks where I kind of felt like I was back into a normal flow. So I'll take it. But it's just going to be an exhausting week, because even though the long weekend is great, the short week as a criminal defense attorney is always a little bit brutal. How about you? How's your day? How's your week starting?
I'm so sorry, Addie.
That's okay.
It really sucks. And yeah, it took me like a couple of weeks to recover after my first jury trial loss.
Yeah. It's just like, it was an injured child. I think the thing that is just so hard about this job and the personality I think it takes to be a really good lawyer, and maybe I don't know, but to the extent that I think I know, you have to be somebody who, to some extent, thrives off of feedback and thrives off of constant self-improvement. And you have to really, we're going to get into it, I think, a little bit in tonight's episode, but you really have to believe in your clients, and you really have to champion your clients, and feeling like at least maybe in the courtroom setting, right? Like you put on for your clients, you go to battle for your clients. And then when that doesn't go your way, it is just such a hard feeling. And so that case, yeah, my trial had some stuff that just I think will be formative for my career, having that first like trial loss experience. But yeah, you don't really just bounce back from it. So
Man,
yeah, you don't. And you've shared it on here before, so I'm going to share it on you shared that experience and that feeling on here, and so I will join you in saying that it's not a good feeling. And we're not just like we're real people who care and who work hard. And so it's not like, it's really your client's loss at the end of the day, but the all of that work and effort doesn't just like where does that go, So it just kind of is a feeling afterwards that's a little bit difficult. But yeah, I'm feeling like I'm getting back on my feet a little bit, but it was just a very, of course, not every trial. Let's just be honest. People go to trial either side, and nobody can win every single trial. Right.
I mean, for defense attorneys, I mean, we lose most of the time,
Yeah.
just period, you know?
Yeah.
And so, the fact that you have wins under your belt at all speaks to how hard you work and how good of a litigator you are.
Right.
And I think it's important to remember that, if the system is working properly, you shouldn't win, right? If the prosecutors are doing their job and only bringing cases that they can actually prove, where there are victims and cops who actually want to participate and who are credible, I don't know.
Yeah.
Just remember, you didn't make the facts. The case is what the case is. And at the end of the day, it was your client's decision to litigate. And win or lose, you wasted their time, and that's fucking awesome. Their case, you know what I mean? You took their time away from other cases that they could have been working. And because they had to try your case, maybe they had to dismiss other cases.
Right. And I mean, also to your point about if the system was working properly, I do take some comfort in the fact that actually going to trial, if plea bargaining didn't work the way that it did, and if certain things didn't work the way that it did, more people would be going to trial. There's a reason trial exists. And the system is built on all of this weighing of different options to some extent that more often than not, people choose not to go to trial. And so I do take
what
some
is it,
comfort
97% of cases or something resolved outside of trial, right?
Something like that. Yeah. And it's just so I do take some comfort in there is a reason you go to trial. There's a reason to go to trial. And so, yeah. And at the end of the day, I think, all of those experiences are just going to make me a better lawyer. So, even the ones that are not super fun make you a better lawyer. So,
you don't grow when you're comfortable.
No.
Right?
And trial is a very uncomfortable experience. And for lawyers who think otherwise, good for you. But I don't find trials to be inherently comfortable. So
how many have you had work on your own?
This is my second solo, I think. I've had others that I second chaired, and then I had another one where I had a second chair who chaired with me. But yeah, so again,
it's
really
like everything else. The more you do it, the easier it gets. Remember when you were appearing in court and you were so stressed out about how to ask for a continuance? You know what I mean? It's everything's hard before it's easy.
It gets easier. It's just very difficult, and the come down is hard. So I'm learning. I mean, we talk about the stuff on here of what it's like to be a lawyer. More often than not, the things that come with being a lawyer aren't always positive feelings. You leave your job a lot feeling these kind of hard feelings. And and it's okay. But, I take comfort in that I know I won't feel that way always. And I know that other lawyers have felt the same way too.
It's a trip, man. It's something that I've only recently realized about myself is like, no matter what I do, it's never enough.
No.
You know what I mean? Like, I'm never happy with myself. I'm always like mad at myself for something.
It's hard.
Do you get that with this job too? It's like, fuck, there's always like something. It's so annoying.
It's always something that I think I should have done better. And it's like what I was saying, what I was trying to say is that I think that is a characteristic that makes people good lawyers. And I think that is a characteristic that is inherent in people becoming lawyers, or most of the lawyers that I'm at least friends with, right? To some extent, everybody that I know that does this job and I think does it well carries that level of self-reflection and carries that level of personality of wanting to be good at something. And it just because that might make you great at your job, it does come with the price tag of it being really hard to live inside your head sometimes.
Yes, dude.
Yeah. Second guessing yourself when you have to be really confident in your decision making, whether it's trial, whether it's literally anything. I always feel like I should have done something better. Even when I, in time, realized that I did something great, I always feel like I should have done something better. So I hope that goes away or gets better. What about you?
Yeah.
What's up with you?
Let's see. My ADHD fixation is now like focused on Shark Tank again. Yeah, I just go through periods of being obsessed with stuff. I was in a Shark Tank era for like a month and I kind of like moved on. I was just playing a lot of Baldur's Gate, but now I'm back in that Shark Tank life. Yeah. What am I going to say? Mr. Wonderful, what has he taught me? 97% of wine in America is sold for less than $12 a bottle. And Costco is the largest distributor of wine in America.
Like, let me tell you, I don't think I've ever watched an episode of Shark Tank in my life, but America runs on Costco and most of America runs on wine. So that is something that makes sense to me. And I do buy wine at Costco. So I love that.
You've never watched Shark Tank?
I think I've watched like bits and pieces of it, but I would say ADHD goes kind of the opposite end where yes, I hyper focus on like one show or hyper fixate on a single show or something like that, but it's never been Shark Tank. And that type of watching entrepreneurs pitch their ideas gives me like vicarious social anxiety where I would just be so mortified if it was me having to pitch something, even if I thought it was a good idea. So that inherently the concept of Shark Tank makes me very uncomfortable.
I mean, it's capitalist propaganda. Listen.
That's true.
But, you know, man, God, you know what I was fixated on before this is the fucking Vietnam War.
You were fixated on the Vietnam War?
Yes. Well, specifically the atrocities committed by the American military.
Okay, I went through that in college, so I understand that hyperfixation. And I had a college professor who I think he taught a class. I didn't take his class, but I think he taught a class strictly on, I think the Vietnam War. I think it was a history class, but in his PhD, I think was in history. But yeah, that we had a crossroads with that subject in a philosophy class when I was in college. And yeah, I think that it's kind of funny to me, and not, I say funny with like a like
strange. Yeah.
Yes. It's like funny in a very not funny way about how like the Vietnam War is just like a flip page in American history when you're in school. And it's like,
so true.
Wait a second, let's revisit that. No.
Terrible shit. Of course.
You've been in the trenches with your ADHD.
I've been in the trenches, man. Yeah, Shark Tank is a little less stressful of a fixation.
Well, on the note of being less stressed out, what are you drinking tonight?
Well, speaking of Costco,
it's
the Kirkland brand seltzer.
She's no longer. She's taking a break from being a Truly girl. I am drinking.
No, I finished my Trulies.
Oh,
I know.
Yeah. Well, I am being a sober girly tonight. As we've said on this podcast before, we are friendly of the people who don't want to drink alcohol. I'm drinking an Arnold Palmer. I made it yesterday. It is delicious. So We had like a glimmer of sunshine yesterday. And in my world, that means you're making a pitcher of tea. So I made a big pitcher of Arnold Palmer yesterday, like fresh squeezed the lemons and everything. And I am drinking that tonight and it's very good. So, yes.
Oh, such a healthy girl. Healthy girly.
Oh, not at all, but not at all, but thank you.
Well, speaking of health and I mean, not really health, maybe youth, question
Okay.
mark. Kyle Rittenhouse.
Oh,
It was only 17 years old when he made his way to Wisconsin to start
become a
some trouble.
client. Become a client of
Yes.
someone's. Yes. Because I was thinking about it. I know that we've talked about how we wanted to talk about interesting things on this podcast. And that's been the conversation kind of off air, things that we've talked about. And something that once we decided we wanted to talk about Kyle Rittenhouse, I was like, okay, Kyle Rittenhouse is a big topic. Like, surely other podcasts have talked about him. And so I, went on a bunch of different podcasts and listened to their episodes about Kyle Rittenhouse. And I'm hoping that we bring something kind of unique to the table with our perspective on it. But I really wanted to kind of tie it to something we've talked about on here before, just at the offset, about how your position as a person can sometimes be conflicting with your position as an attorney. Because, of course, when I think about Kyle Rittenhouse as a defense attorney, and I'm going to be controversial on here. And so I just wanted to start the tone before we get into this conversation that this is going to upset some people. And I don't mean to be insensitive or, anything harmful on this podcast about talking about Kyle Rittenhouse, because he's a very controversial character across the board, politically, socially, pretty much anything you can think of. But from the perspective of a defense attorney, and I want to talk, I'm sure we'll talk about kind of also how that feels as a person who's not a defense attorney, like when you take your defense attorney hat off, the feelings that his case stirs. Strictly from a defense perspective, fascinating case in terms of strategy, in terms of you have a client who some of your concerns, I think, going into a case aren't super present in terms of like prior criminal history to a big degree. You have, in some ways, a very sympathetic client as somebody who's very young. There's so many things that are, I think, having to be considered strictly from a defense attorney perspective. And,
Well, yes, I love what you're saying. And I think that let's go through like what happened and then dissect it from like a defense attorney perspective, like how we would look at these facts and like maybe the strategy, you know what I mean? Like how a criminal defense attorney would kind of like game plan this out, like with exactly what you're saying, like how he looks innocent and he probably doesn't have any criminal history. He just has this little baby face, right? Those are all like things that would play into our strategy.
Right.
So with that being said, let's see here. Admittedly, I had a pretty long day in court, and so I didn't do like probably as much research on this as I should. So Addie, please like supplement my my little summary here if it's at all like wrong. But from my understanding, okay, so like traveling back in time, it's August of 2020, right? There's all of this unrest going on.
The country's in disarray.
Absolutely. Yeah. When did George Floyd happen? Was that earlier in 2020 in like the summer still?
So George Floyd happened. Let me look. I was trying to do that timeline as well. So George Floyd died in 2020. I think it was May of 2020.
Okay. So just like a few months before this.
And then you have, go ahead. I'll supplement as you go.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Okay. So Kenosha, Wisconsin, protests are breaking out because a white police officer shot and killed, I believe he was 29 years old, Jacob Blake, who was a Black man. So protests are erupting, and Kyle Rittenhouse is a 17-year-old kid. He has like an AR-15 style rifle, and he testified something to the effect of saying that he was going over to Kenosha. And by the way, he lived in Illinois. So he was traveling over to Kenosha, Wisconsin in order to like provide aid.
Kind of how I understand it is that there's some interesting characters that need to be introduced. So
Okay.
Kyle Rittenhouse was very good friends with another person who I believe lived in Kenosha. And I think that the friend of his, I believe, used to date his sister. So Kyle Rittenhouse, I think, was in Kenosha visiting his friend. His friend was above the age of 17. I believe his friend bought Kyle Rittenhouse the gun that is going to be in question in this case because Kyle Rittenhouse was a minor. There had been, there's some, I think, the thing that's really complicated about his case is I'm kind of pivoting to narrating, but also talking about the defense perspective of some stuff in his case. There's some facts I think that are really kind of peripheral, but are quite interesting in terms of this used car lot. And there was also, I believe, a Facebook group that was, or some sort of social media group that was, I think, kind of supported by maybe a city council member or something, encouraging the community to basically take up arms to defend some of the property damage that had been happening in the city. At the time of where kind of setting the stage, my understanding is that Kyle Rittenhouse and his friend were were volunteering essentially at the high school that, oddly enough, I believe was like across from the courthouse.
Like washing graffiti away,
yes.
right? And that's earlier this same night before all this drama.
Yes. And then there's some sort of interesting character that gets inserted regarding a used car lot who had reached out to, I believe, Kyle and his friend. I'm unclear on the details of what exactly happened with that, but basically expressing some concerns about the various property damage that had been happening at his car lots. Because my understanding is that there had been a lot of fires and stuff in Kenosha at the time regarding the protesting. And so when Kyle Rittenhouse, I think something that's very interesting in his case is the kind of turn in events from going from washing graffiti to this conversation with the used car salesman to then basically taking that as being deputized to then go home to his friend's house. It is my understanding that the gun his friend previously purchased for him was at his friend's stepfather's house, and that the guns had previously been like in a gun cabinet.
Damn, girl, you went deep.
I know a lot about the Rittenhouse story. They had the stepfather had those unlocked because of some of the quote unquote looting that had been happening in the community. And so they took the guns and went downtown. Something that's also kind of interesting to kind of contextualize this is, back to the defense perspective, is a lot of information. This case is 4 years old, but it took some time before it went to trial. And during that time, people, not only his attorneys, but the general public was looking into who Kyle Rittenhouse is and as a person. And my understanding from the sources that I kind of dove into, I went back to the podcast, The Daily, and that they did a little special leading up to the trial where a reporter who's from Kenosha had actually left the scene of the incident earlier that night because she got bad vibes. And so then she was the boots on the ground reporting on the trial once the trial was happening. And so her perspective on it was very interesting. But there was a lot of information about how Kyle Rittenhouse was somebody who had become fascinated with the police in his youth and had taken some, I think, camps and stuff that were kind of police influenced, and then some firefighter adjacent ones. And then he really started getting an interest in politics, which adds this other fun mix to the fact that this became a very political case. So that's kind of going on in the background too. And then you flash forward to the incident. So, he's back out in the community. At this point, they have guns on. He has a gun on him. I believe his friend was stationed, I think, on a rooftop overlooking, I think, the car lot. And I think his friend's name's Dominic, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's his first name. Kyle's like in the crowd, and they're not alone in being a group of people that are basically. Oh, and I think Kyle Rittenhouse also had some medic stuff on him. And so that will come
Claims
into
he
play.
was an EMT at some point, right? But he definitely.
So we're gonna get there.
Okay.
So he, I think he said he was like a medic and trying to help people. And keep in mind, there's also this other social media group going on where people are being encouraged to take up arms. The reporter whose recount of this that I listened to from the Daily, she explained how she had seen several people that were primarily white men with weapons, and she had encountered a gentleman who was in like full camo who indicated that he was supportive of what the protesters who were supporting, the protesting against the police brutality and the killing of Black men and the unrest that was happening nationwide. This man said that he was supportive of that message, but he just was wanting to make sure that no property got damaged. But she indicated that the presence and tone were definitely of an intimidating nature, and made this kind of tension between that type of party and then the other people that were also out protesting kind of clash even further. So enter Kyle Rittenhouse, who's this young, at the time, 17-year-old white man, young kid who there were people, live streaming. There's all sorts of media coverage going on, from just people who were there to people like this gal prior to her leaving that were actually press associated. This isn't unique to Kenosha at this time either. This is happening all over the country, but this is what the scene was like in Kenosha. He's on the scene. He is interacting with people. There's people who I guess were hurt, and he's, there's audio, I think, of different interactions that he had with the crowd earlier in the evening of him talking to people, him introducing himself as Kyle to people and saying that he was a medic. Obviously, we know we know now that he's a 17-year-old kid. He wasn't a medic, but he was engaging with a lot of people and just kind of inserting himself into some situations, which I think is an interesting fact in his case.
That's interesting.
So that's kind of setting the stage of what happened prior to, obviously where it shifts into a very, what is the split time of the actual, what's it on trial, right? So this is all the lead up. I think it's important for us to revisit some of those facts in there as we kind of talk about his trial, and how to defend.
That's really important context.
Yeah. And then
so he's with this group. He gets separated.
Yes. And there's a gentleman who I think, from just purely a narrative perspective, that really the evening seems to have kind of turned, even though there was obviously some, I think, kind of maybe some buildup. The evening really turns when there's a gentleman who is the first gentleman who got shot. And he, I believe, Rosenbaum, I think.
Yeah.
Yes. He's an interesting character in the story too, because my understanding is that he is someone who had been, I believe, in the hospital earlier that day. He had a plastic bag of some items with him. I think he threw them at one point. He has some mental health concerns. He has a prior criminal history. He gets kind of isolated, and he's kind of in the same kind of isolated space as Kyle Rittenhouse. Eventually, somebody that's not either of those two people fires a gun into the air. And then Kyle Rittenhouse shoots 4 shots at Mr. Rosenbaum. And from there...
And Kyle said, if I'm not mistaken, I think he had testified that Rosenbaum had threatened to kill him like twice that evening.
So I think that the dynamics between he and the first person that he shot are something that is definitely an issue in his case. But that is just kind of the snippet of just the stage. So maybe some contentious more words were exchanged, which I think comes to play in terms of the defense side of things. But that's just the very condensed version. And
we know Kyle, I think he also said that he thought that the guy, when he threw the plastic bag at him, he thought that it was a chain or something. But during cross-examination, I believe he admitted that he knew that he was unarmed. But yeah, he shot him 4 times.
Yes.
And then he keeps running, right?
Well, my understanding is I believe he called Dominic. I can't remember if he called Dominic. I can't remember if he called Dominic after shooting the first person or after the second. But I believe I'm gray on it, but he calls him at some point and says, I shot someone. And so that happens to what I remember of the case. And this is me blanketly going off of the other parts of the podcasts that I've listened to. So then he kind of starts running away. There's also throughout the evening, there's, I think, something that's also heavily debated and kind of more contentious in his case is this other dynamic of the treatment that law enforcement was giving the people that were kind of in the same category as Kyle Rittenhouse, of people who were armed at these events, trying to dissuade the protesters. I believe Kyle Rittenhouse was given water by law enforcement at some point, and kind of thanked for being there. So that's kind of going on as well. But, for the rest of the people that are there, a person just got shot. And so, there's a person that's actively...
right. Their perspective, right? You're protesting like police brutality, and all of a sudden you like hear a gunshot and you see this punk ass kid running through the crowd with a fucking AR. Like, yeah, that's probably the perspective of a lot of these people who are protesting, which brings us to the second person. Right.
And so there's people that are in the crowd that are responding, trying to help the first person. And then also keep in mind, like, the community is also very like, there's a shooter. We need to what are we doing about
this? America. Mass shootings happen all the time.
Right. And so some people are running away, and then there's some people that are like, we want to disarm the shooter, or so goes the argument that that's what's going on with the people who then seek out Kyle Rittenhouse, because people are not wanting him to get away. So there's a crowd of people that kind of go after him. And there is a gentleman who hits Kyle Rittenhouse with a skateboard. And I always forget this gentleman's last name. I mess it up.
Huber, I think. Mr. Huber.
And he hits Kyle with the skateboard, and then he gets shot in the chest. So those are, and I think it's important to remember that Kyle Rittenhouse's case, I think, was 6 counts of different offenses.
Yes. He shot one more person.
Right. So we're getting there.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're getting there. So there's with what's on trial, there's a lot going on, because there's like 6 counts on his trial. And then the last one obviously comes from him maiming a third person. I think the third person he shot in the bicep.
That person was an EMT, I think.
He was a medic. Yeah. And I forget that person's name as well. That's probably in your notes. If I apologize.
Prosecutor. I'm very bad with pronouncing names.
And so, yeah, he shot so there was Joseph Rosenbaum, which was the first person he shot. And then Anthony Huber is the second gentleman that he shot. And then Gage Grosskreutz. I'm going to botch that as well. But, and he got shot in the arm. And that person was armed. I believe that the gentleman he shot last, he was there to provide medical care. He had medical supplies, including a tourniquet and gauze, but he, I believe, had a handgun on him. And that was some sort of issue. I believe that the last gentleman, a very interesting fact at debate at trial too, is that the last gentleman, I believe, put his hands up at one point and he was shot.
I know there was a curfew violation, and I'm assuming the other one was like a weapons.
He had 6 counts. Count 1 was first degree reckless homicide, which is the highest degree of, I believe, first degree murder in Wisconsin. Count 2 is first degree recklessly endangering safety and use of a dangerous weapon. Count 3, first degree recklessly endangering safety, use of a dangerous weapon. So counts 2 and 3 are the same. Count 4, first degree intentional homicide, use of a dangerous weapon. Count 5, attempted first degree intentional homicide, use of a dangerous weapon. And count 6 was possession of a dangerous weapon by a person under 18. Oh, and count 7, that's the part you mentioned. I thought it was only 6. Count 7 was failure to comply with an emergency order from state or local government, which was the curfew charge. He had a lot of mixed charges. That's kind of the bird's eye view. If I missed anything, please fill in the gaps.
No, that was amazing. That was a very comprehensive summary. Thank you so much for taking the time to look through all of that information.
Yeah.
Okay. So criminal defense attorney hats on. What do we see? A baby-faced 17-year-old. And automatically, my head's going to self-defense. Self-defense is an affirmative defense, and affirmative defenses are defenses where we're saying, hey, yes, my client did it, but because X, Y, and Z, it's justifiable, right?
And I think that I'm going to just kind of walk through the train of thought to get there too, because I think that the thing that's hard about when you come into a case and you're looking to see if you have a defense, in his case, there were people who he was identified by several people. So you have people who have put him at the scene. There's statements of him and, calling himself Kyle. There's not
video.
There's not an identification defense on the surface, right? You have 2 people who are dead and you have 1 person who got shot in the arm. Not to minimize any of those things, but that's the set of facts you're walking into as a defense attorney. And so when you have a situation where, somebody did something, the defense, I think, perspective, it can mold and shift over time. But in his case, if you have statements where maybe there was some interaction with the first victim, then you have a bunch of people who came after him, including him getting hit by somebody with a skateboard with the second victim. Then you have a third victim who had a handgun. I think self-defense would be for sure the first thing that's triggered. And it's an affirmative defense. I think the other thing that you have to consider is you have charges that if you don't beat them, your client's spending potentially the rest of their life in prison, right? And so, I don't know what that looks like in that degree of a case where you have that high of stakes. But I imagine, maybe the state's also playing some hardball and not really giving you an offer because you have a community that's just reeling about the political tension. You have pressure probably as a prosecutor to assuage some of the political tension and calm it down. It's volatile in terms of just figuring out what to do. And so you walk in as a defense attorney, you have a case that's incredibly political. You have a client who might be going to jail for a very long time. You probably don't have a great plea offer on the table. You have a kid as a client who's, being charged as an adult.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but have you represented kids before?
Yes. It's difficult. I have a lot of juvenile clients. Yeah. And so you're
punk-ass kids.
Right.
Which I love them, but it's you have to explain this to a kid.
Right.
You have to get a kid to appreciate the magnitude of what's happening and work with you on a strategy to defend themselves when their brain's not fully developed. You
Right.
know what I
And
mean? It's
and 17 is still a kid. I'm just going to
yeah.
say, if you think that people who are 17 are close to being adults, no.
Your
And
brain's not fully developed till you're 25.
no. And also just most 17-year-olds, Kyle Rittenhouse had a little bit of it sounds like somewhat of a tumultuous childhood, but he's a kid. And so he, comes into you get this client, you have this case, and you're like, really? It's when I first got it, was like, it's kind of like self-defense or nothing.
For real.
It's
I mean, there's no
self-defense.
denying that he did it.
It's
I think.
self-defense or you plea out. That's messy. I think it's also important to point out, Kyle Rittenhouse's situations were the subject of a lot of media attention and scrutiny on, from a left perspective, he's a villain. He's a vigilante. He's all of these things. And on the right side of politics, he's a patriot. And so you have a situation that is very heated. And then you also have a bunch of people that are like crowdfunding his defense, where people which I think was more of that than probably any other defendant in American history. I mean, it was just.
Did you ever watch Orange is the New Black?
I tried. I never really got into it.
Okay. All right. It's okay. This just reminds me of in Orange is the New Black, there's this character called, her nickname's Kansataki or Pensataki. And basically she ended up like getting in a fight with this person at an abortion clinic, and she shot her just because she like felt disrespected, right? It wasn't political, but it was like picked up by the political right, and they raised all this money to defend her and stuff. And anyway, it just reminds me of this exactly. I wonder how much they raised total. We should look that up. I bet it is a lot.
I remember it was shocking. And then you also have, while you look that up, the other things that are just so interesting is that Kyle, I was looking at the article, I believe there's an article about it in the Daily Mail, where it talks about how his defense team did 2 mock jury trial runs before deciding to put him on the stand to testify, which I think is kind of the future of,
interesting.
I think that's the future of criminal defense if you can afford it, right?
If you can afford it.
Where if a jury it finds your story, especially when you're putting on a defense, to be more compelling if you testify. In Kyle Rittenhouse's case, you have a kid that's on the stand. You have a kid that's not super impeachable, other than maybe by prior inconsistent statements. But he's not a kid that has some of the other concerns for impeachment in terms of.
And
like,
let's talk about that real quick. So as far as impeachment goes, when we're deciding whether to have a client testify, which just generally speaking, like the age-old wisdom is just like, no, it's not a good idea. Right? That's what I always hear. Like, just don't.
I think I'm so the opposite on that.
Really?
Yes. I think that you are cautioned heavily to not have your client testify. I think that juries like to hear from people because even though the law doesn't require every side to the story, I think that there's something going on where juries want to hear from people. And if you have a client that you think will do well on the stand and doesn't have some of the impeachment concerns, I feel like my approach, and maybe the approach of some of the other attorneys that I work with, is yes, unless. So it's like,
interesting.
And obviously it's your client's choice, right? Whether or not they want to testify. But if I feel like my client is going to do well on the stand, I really want to give them some confidence to feel like they can tell their story if they want to. If I have concerns that they won't do well on the stand, that's a very different conversation. But I think attorneys get scared that their client is going to say something wrong, which in some cases is very true. But, there's times where your clients might help you. And I think that we want to protect our
That's
clients.
so true.
There's times where I think we view our job as us protecting our clients and being a shield for our clients instead of us being a teammate with our client. And I think when it comes to the conversation of testifying, my approach is yes, unless, instead of no, unless. It's like, yeah, unless I think you're going to screw it up, or yes, unless I think there's going to be all this stuff about your criminal history come up, or yes, unless I think you're going to perjure yourself, or some concern.
Yeah. Like if your client has like a drug issue, maybe they'll be super high on the day of trial.
Well, that's a different concern.
Maybe they can get, there's just a lot of things, right? I'm just like,
I just don't, I think that your clients can really help you and they can help themselves. And that's more the focus. It's like, and usually you talk to your client about what type of stuff you want to talk about when they're in trial. Like, hey, if you were going to testify, these are things that I think are important that the jury might want to hear from you. And you give them the things that maybe the case up until that point is lacking. And then, you make a game time decision. But I think in his case, when his attorneys were having to make some decisions and really prepare their case, they had the financial resources to kind of be creative and really prepare his case. And back to my saying of, I'm going to piss people off by saying this, but well done from the defense team. You do what you have to do to protect your client. And whether your client is a unsympathetic or unsympathetic person, and you feel like you couldn't represent him, congrats, you don't have to do this job. But some of us do. And for those of us who do, you got to do this job well, because your job is to protect your client. And he had a good team behind him. I think that one of the really famous retired Harvard law professors, I think it's Alan Dershowitz. Is that who that professor's name is? I believe so. He was talking, or Alan Dershowitz. He was saying that the decision to put Rittenhouse on the stand was essential towards getting the acquittal, because he thinks that is something that the jury needed, especially when you are putting on a self-defense claim. Because when you're putting on a self-defense claim, you really need 3 ingredients, right? You need to know that the person, you need to know that there was a situation in which the person was afraid, that the person was acting because they were afraid, and that how they acted was reasonable. And I think in Kyle Rittenhouse's case, the question for the jury came down to just reasonableness, which I think a lot of people might think the jury got it wrong. But in terms of the reasonableness from his perspective,
from a person in his shoes,
you don't get that unless he testifies. Because it's just, you would be speculating, and you could maybe make that claim an argument in closing argument. But, I don't think you hear that Kyle was afraid unless Kyle explains that.
No, you're totally right. He had to say that he felt threatened in order for it to be justifiable, right? I mean, the jury could have made that inference, but it's certainly stronger, having him testify to that effect.
Right. And I think that the thing that is hard about his case, and the thing that very rarely do I like to play the game of, well, if I was a prosecutor, but in his case, something I thought about with from the state's perspective is that it's interesting, because so often you are taught that a reasonable person's perspective is what anybody would do. But when it's a self-defense claim, it's what a reasonable person in that person's shoes would do. And I think that slight difference is really interesting. I think that maybe the state could have hinged more on that's not reasonable to anybody, because of all of I think they could have laid more ground for the pieces of it that could point more towards premeditation, which then I think sets the clock back prior to a reaction that is indicative of self-defense. But, they had a really hard job at the end of the day too, because there's a community that is just trying to make sense of a big mess. And the courthouse happened to be like, the courthouse where this case was heard was in the same community and kind of in the same proximity of where this case happened. And so it is it was not an open and shut case for the defense. It was not an open and shut case for the state. Like both parties had their work cut out for them with this case.
And how lucky though, like the defense had enough money to just basically like try it until they got it right? Figure out a trial strategy by just having these testers and paying to do it again and again until they figured out what was going to be the most effective. I find that fascinating.
I find that to be something that will, if more people knew that that's something that happened, I think people would be bothered by that. But as a defense attorney, you only get one shot really to make your case, and all of the prep work that you can do to some extent, I feel like is fair game. If you have resources, which, back to being a public defender, I have a lot of resources, but my clients don't necessarily have a ton of resources. And if I could do anything to help my clients with when the stakes are that high, of course you consider options. And if you have options on the table in terms of like seeing what a trial looks like, I would understand why a defense attorney would do that. And in his case, especially when you're going to have a client testify who has become so, scrutinized in the media to the extent that even the president at the time was talking about him. Like, it's just,
it's a trip.
Or the former president, I should say, just crazy. And so, very interesting across the board, very frustrating, I think, in a million different ways. I think that something that's underrated in his case too is the role the judge played. Because I think the judge was being much more of a gatekeeper in terms of some of the other constitutional issues that I think jurors were worried about. Because I think there was a juror who was saying that or a prospective juror who was like, I'm going to be incapable of being impartial in this process because I'm a firm believer in the Second Amendment. And the judge was like, well, the Second Amendment's not on trial here. Like that is settled law.
No,
so
there was.
Yeah. 100%. And so there's, people who I think were commentating all of this are like, yes, there's of course a flavor. And I think the judge even pointed out there's, concerns about somebody taking up arms in this case. Yes, there's concerns about all sorts of things in this case, but really what was on trial, whether or not it was reasonable for Kyle Rittenhouse to have shot 3 people. And I think it's frustrating from the social perspective, because I think one of the prospective jurors said that no matter what happened, 50% of America would be mad at you. And, it's sad that it happened at a time where, people were really already protesting kind of like what some of the community viewed as like a wrongful death. And then this is like what happened in a chronological, events. But it's just, it will
like
always
one
be
tragedy after another tragedy.
Yeah. And I just feel like, I don't know. I feel like that juror was really right, that I think most people feel some way about Kyle Rittenhouse. Like he will be a household name of just, you either hate him and think he should have been found guilty, or you think that him being acquitted was the right verdict. I use that one all the time.
I mean, what's right? Like,
I just had a brain
like you
fart
were
on
saying
verdict.
earlier. No, you're fine. But like, what's right? Like in the law, right? And what's like what feels right personally?
Yeah.
It's not the same.
No.
And I think you're right. He's not going away.
No. And it was just, it's just so
I think he has like a nonprofit. I think he wants to get involved in politics, relocated to Texas.
That's interesting. Has he kept his name? Do you know that?
I would be shocked if he hasn't kept his name because his name is an asset, I think, in the circles he runs in, right? Like he's been a talking person for Turning Point USA. Um, Freaking Marjorie Taylor Greene tried to like introduce some bill, like the Kyle Rittenhouse Gold Medal of Freedom bill or something. Like there's just a
No.
lot. All of these, like Matt Gaetz, all of these big names in the political conservative realm have like publicly offered him internships. So I bet that he'll run for office one day.
You heard it
How
here
much you want to
first.
bet?
Some political forecasting.
That's right. Right here, Drinks with the Benders. Oh, fuck, man. It's
I just, you know, again, I just come back down to you. Hats off to defense attorneys who put in good cases for their clients. It's not easy. And as much as Kyle Rittenhouse will be scrutinized for, I think, as long as I'm around on this planet, so will his attorneys, even though they have much of a less famous name. I think some people don't agree. I listened to snippets of some of the closing arguments too, and I thought that the kind of that tension of just, we're here in trial because of what's happening in the community, not necessarily what my client did. And that's not exactly what was said, but some of that flavor. And
that's a really good theme for the case is like the society is not on trial right now. Like all of this terrible shit going on in our society is not on trial. Like it's this specific circumstance, it's this specific boy. Like
yeah.
that's a really good theme. That's a good strategy.
But I think he was framing it as though they should have been like, we are here because of that, not, and like a response to that. And it's just interesting. I thought that the defense attorney, I was listening to somebody else's comment, because there was like a short podcast series where it had another defense, I think he was maybe a defense attorney, some attorney, maybe it was a prosecutor, was doing short snippets of commentary on different parts of the trial. And his perception of closing argument was that the state did a great job, but that this defense's closing argument was weaker than their opening, which I also thought was interesting because I think that normally people view an acquittal as you had to have a really great closing argument. But again, argument's not evidence. It's just your plea to the jury of what you think you should have. So very interesting case across the board. You also have to contextualize it in the world in which we were living in. Like I think some people still felt wrong about some of what was happening with, as you mentioned earlier, what was going on with the George Floyd trials in terms of the police that were involved in that. It was a very messy backdrop for a very kind of messy case. So
it's so fascinating. It makes me think of like the OJ trial too, like how these big cultural phenomenon like play such a pivotal role in some of these notorious courtroom trials.
Yeah, I think it's and I think that there's a lot of very interesting similarity between the OJ trial and the Rittenhouse trial.
Dude, I haven't thought about that for real.
I haven't either. I think that's very interesting in terms of just even just the public perception of all of it, and so.
And it just comes down to race in America and police brutality both times.
Well, and also a really good defense theory of a case, right?
Yeah.
Some defense attorneys, you don't pick some of us don't pick our cases, but you get a case and it's like the set of facts happen and you have to make some magic out of sometimes a shit show. Everybody knows the OJ, taglines from the defense. And there's not anything as famous, I think, from the Rittenhouse trial, but everybody knows that, Kyle Rittenhouse's face was a meme for a while because him being on trial, like him testifying at his trial, was, I think, a big turning point in that case. And that came down to a very intentional move by the defense. So, yeah.
We did it again. Team.
I mean, I appreciate you kind of picking the topic. I know we wanted to talk about it for a while, but it's just interesting. I feel like it's one of those cases where I will probably have different opinions on it for like 10 years from now, it's one of those things that I think culturally will be something that people will have opinions on that will change and develop over time because it is such a turning point, I think, culturally.
Oh my God, I have another prediction that he's going to write a book. He's going to write a book before he runs for office. And it's going to be, I feel like he's going to release the book in his, by the time he's 25.
I could see him trying to be like a senator or something. That makes sense to me.
100%. Oh, yeah. I don't know, though. These senators make good money.
Yes.
He might be able to have a more profitable career as like a Turning Point USA spokesman or something.
You never know. I mean, he might kind of go back to politics after he's had more of like a political adjacent career, but
not that we're team Rittenhouse, but we're just opining on political.
Hey,
I'm going to have like a yard sign. I'm not. Okay, fam.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us, Addie. That was a fucking fabulous deep dive.
Hey, I love this shit. So, and I know you do too. And that's why we have Drinks with Defenders. So on that note, cheers.
Cheers.